So now that we get to thinking about spirit and ways to think about God, and we think about it first, second, and third person, think about it as all of those encapsulated in the emerging fourth person perspective. But you touch on several of these important issues, so I want to just jump in and read some of these. The evolutionary mind of God. Because first we come to the difficulties of representing God or spirit in intellectual terms. There is no human-created description of God that is without contradiction. Any minimal definition of God we can conjure up entails multiple infinities, such as omnipotence, omniscience, or eternal existence. However, when a being is infinite in all directions, the infinitudes cross and begin to contradict each other. The schoolyard riddle that asks if God could make a stone so heavy he can't lift it is just one simple case of how infinite capacity is muddled when one's infinitudes are pitted against each other. The many other inherent paradoxes of God pointed out by theologians usually rest in these battling infinite dimensions. How can a being be infinitely just and infinitely merciful? How can it be boundlessly omniscient and free-willed? And if God is defined as less than infinite, even in a few dimensions, then it becomes a God few want to honor, since humans, even in our lesser minds, can imagine a greater God, one who is infinite in all directions, even though this God as defined is full of contradictions. This discussion takes God at his most naked and leaves out the extra burdens of religious clothing. But that is a difficulty in trying to have a finite mind define a multitude of infinities. So as you point out here, God, cannot be all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good. Or, for example, he wouldn't allow Auschwitz. He can be two of those three. He can be all-knowing and all-powerful if he's not all-good. Or he can be all-good and all-powerful if he's not all-knowing. But as soon as you acknowledge all three, you have contradictions. And so you continue, but any description of the universe without God, and this is to take the second major stance that you discuss here. The first is the general theistic stance and the contradictions in it. But the second major stance, any description of the universe without God is also compromised with contradictions. How does existence begin with no beginning? If the universe is deterministic, what determines its first motion? In a field of infinities, why is anything at all finite? And so these contradictions, of course, are gleefully overlooked by atheists. Then you state one is left with the conclusion that both God and no God are impossible, at least to our limited human minds. Both possibilities could, of course, simply be beyond human comprehension, and their inherent contradictions, so apparent to us, could be resolved by intellects greater than ours. Indeed, some theists who assert the reality of God counter contradictions by claiming God is ineffable, that is, unknowable by us, and therefore has no definition. This seems like a cop-out to the atheists who assert that the reality of no God is at least definable. Atheists counter the contradictions in their own view by claiming our ignorance and inabilities can be overcome via science. In a recent blaze of publicity and attention, atheists have come out of the shadows in contemporary culture and are denouncing a religion of gods and promoting the superior perspective of no God as a view that should appeal to the modern and technologically oriented. And it has. Nerds and techies find the scientific approach of current atheism extremely appealing. And that's, of course, discussing Dawkins, Sam Harris, Chris Hitchens, and so on. But recently a third way of imagining the ground of being has emerged, which is also very appealing to techies. It stems from one of the most ancient theologies, but this ancient orientation is being rejuvenated by scientific and technological understandings. Judged from my own discussions with educated and rational people, this third view is more appealing to them than the blankness of atheism, and I suspect in the long run more likely to gain allegiance of those who can't make that leap into a belief of God. This new third way is a type of pantheism. The orthodox definition of God, God transcends the universe. The universe in this view is a creation issuing from God. The universe has the same relation to God as a story or painting would to us. As authors, we transcend our masterpiece. While the universe reflects the nature of its creator, it is decidedly other. The furthest of the two, creator and creation, might be entwined is into a duality like a body and soul. We might say the author was the soul of the work. In Augustine's metaphor from the 4th century, the universe is the body for God's soul. In atheism, there is, of course, no duality. The universe simply is. But pantheism, at least in its revived form, offers a concept of godhood with unity. There are many historical varieties of pantheism, but most could fairly be summed up in a literal translation and description. All God. Creation and God are not separate. All is one. The philosophers of pantheism like to say that rather than God transcending the universe, God is eminent in the universe. Mystics since the dawn of consciousness have claimed to be awakened to the startling fact that since the universe is God, each of us contains God, or even more shocking, is God. God is everywhere we look. And so this is indeed a startling third alternative to the other two, and is indeed starting to catch on. Thoughts on that, reflections on that?
Well, I think I'm an amateur philosopher. I'm an amateur theologian. So, listening to myself here, I realize that there's probably a lot more to say about it. But I think as a rough approximation that this is what's happening. I think there is first of all, one of the things that's really true about this domain that we're in is that there's a lot of baggage of centuries that's carried forth with some of these words. And so the word pantheism, it carries a lot of weight from former uses of it. And so I suspect that, if it were to catch on, it would catch on by a different name. It would be recast in more contemporary vocabulary. And that's, in effect, what I'm trying to do, is that I'm trying to infuse some of the thinking about these very big questions with the new vocabulary around science and technology. Because I believe that they have far, belief in science, I think has far more in common than the normal debates would allow them to have. And I think part of our inability to imagine them having an overlap or maybe even being in parallel is because we don't have a sufficient vocabulary. And so this was sort of an attempt to frame it in a unified set of metaphors. And, I welcome, it's a first stab. I'm not going to convince anybody with that argument. I think people far more versed in this stuff have to make something that's a little bit more emotional and have more of a narrative. But I think that I see us headed, us meaning collectively as a society, headed in the direction of having this conversation in these terms. So, I don't know where in the kind of the world of the religious, they're not having this conversation, and I don't think the world of scientists are having this conversation either. But I think we could have that conversation. Yeah,
so do I. And the ones that are having this particular type of conversation are ones that are scientifically oriented, in my experience, but that have had direct spiritual experience and know that these type of some sort of spiritual flavor makes absolute sense for the universe, and in fact seems just almost impossible to deny. And that tends to be the conviction that spiritual experiences convey. And my understanding is that when you were 27, you had just that type of experience. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's true.
Can we talk a little bit about that? It was
sure.
Yeah, you were in one of your earth-traveling vagabond modes, and had run out of money and ended up sleeping in what was purported to be the place of Christ's crucifixion. And as you awoke that morning, had a very profound experience that has not only stayed with you, but been a crucial component of your own outlook on life.
Yeah, exactly. So, I went to Asia instead of going to college, and I, as a photographer, self-designated photographer, recording the vanishing traditions of Asia, I spent a lot of time at religious ceremonies where most of the color is, so to speak, and went to Zen temples, went to Buddhist retreats, went to the Hindu Kumbh Mela, I mean the Valley of Gods in Kulu. I mean, Tibet. I've been everywhere, and so I'd gone to Jerusalem with the same attitude, the same perspective of there, headed there for Easter, and so it was another photo opportunity.
Right.
And unexpectedly, I had a religious conversion on Easter morning. And I think I wasn't looking for it, which is one indication to me that it was probably real. And two, funnily, once I had it, it didn't change my life immediately. And that was another curious aspect, because I'd always thought that if it came, I would instantly be transformed. And I think thirdly, this wasn't a matter of, I'm a very intellectual person, kind of brainy, and so what was surprising to me was sort of the way in which this was not a matter of, it was my brain that sort of had to finally acknowledge this.
Yeah. And
that was the last holdout was, and it did not come through logic. It was not a logical thing. To believe that Jesus Christ was God is not, you don't get there only by logic. And,
right.
But yet I still had to, my brain still had to make that journey. And so that experience, again, of a sort of a type of knowledge that is not transmittable by falsifiable hypothesis.
Right.
Yet still has to, if it's real, has to be subjected to that. I think it has retained, because it was an experiential thing. So the foundation of Western science is actually based on the idea that when we can doubt everything else, this is Cartesian idea, when we can doubt everything else, we have to start with the idea of the one thing we can't doubt,
right,
which is our own existence. And so because I am doubting, because I doubt, therefore I know that there's an I.
Right.
The phrase should really be, I doubt, therefore I am.
Right.
But that's sort of confusing in English. And so it's because I'm skeptical of all these things, and then I know that there's something there that's skeptical, and that therefore the one thing I can't doubt is the fact that there's somebody who's skeptic. That there's and so that experiential center, my experience of faith is what I rest upon, and it seemed to me that it's as valid as the experience of no God. Right. And so, that has made me aware mostly of different world perspectives, that I have a sympathy for the other and the other views, because this view is in certain places a minority view. Other places, of course, is a majority view. Right. But I am aware of the fact that there are things like worldviews that are full of assumptions and are usually unexamined. And so, if anything, I've made it a practice to examine my assumptions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it follows the contours of spiritual experience as the mystics report it the world over. Yeah. And that's clearly also a first-person kind of knowledge. You're not knowing it in a third-person, stand-aside, objective, kind of descriptive, falsifiable type of knowledge, but as a first-person, direct, immediate, existentially revealed consciousness, therefore being. And I can doubt everything else out there. I can doubt my senses. I can doubt even images in my mind, but I can't doubt that which is aware of those things. Right. And so that is really kind of a form of Western Vedanta, and where the Atman, the pure witness in a human, is said to be one with Brahman, one with the absolute ground of all being.
Right.
and known in a direct, first-person, immediate fashion. And that's a kind of knowledge that is unfortunately taken to be, not only outside of science, but just not scientific, just anti-scientific
right.
even. And that's one of the really unfortunate things that comes with that type of spirituality, and I think is also one of the important types of spirituality that doesn't, as often as it should, get talked about in these discussions of, will spiritual machines come into existence? Can human beings, create spiritual machines by 2100? Will we down, that kind of thing? Because what generally is meant by spiritual there is just conscious. And it doesn't take into account at least these two dramatically different forms of consciousness. One's sort of relative, small mind, finite consciousness, and the other being, a big mind, absolute, supreme identity consciousness. And if we're going to download humanity into machines, I'm going to make sure at least both of those kinds of knowledge get on the table for getting downloaded.
Right.